Port Charles has weathered tragedies that would hollow out a lesser town, but nothing has rattled its moral compass quite like the bullet that felled Drew Cain. Police tape and press conferences can only do so much when the wound is communal, when neighbors are forced to consider that the assailant might not be a mobster, a mercenary, or a long-shadowed villain crawling out of the docks, but someone raised at the very heart of their blended families. The latest, most disorienting theory isn't a tabloid leap or a social media lark. It's a slow, awful arithmetic that begins with a child's grief and ends with a trigger pull. By the time the PCPD located the weapon in Elizabeth Weber's home, the story had already stopped behaving like a clean detective novel. The evidence threads back through a school hallway, a family tree with missing branches, and the brittle edge of a little girl's patience. Scout, Elizabeth's former kindergarten classmate and Drew's daughter, sits, unwillingly, at the center of a theory that forces everyone to ask what a child will do when every adult in her life mistakes control for care. To comprehend how such a theory could exist, you have to start with Scout's everyday reality, not the heroic myths that adults tell themselves to survive their choices. A child's world narrows after a funeral, each door that locks after that is not a safety measure but another confirmation that loss breeds smaller rooms. Drew's good intentions became iron bars, changing a name without permission, engineering a future in an elite school that would polish an already polished life, arranging the family chessboard so that brothers like Danny Morgan and Rocco Falconeri were no longer sitting at the same table. In a different season, those choices might have looked like fatherly resolve. In the wake of a mother's death, they resembled the well-lit corridors of a museum where Scout's feelings were the silent exhibits, labeled, controlled, and never touched. The distance from an argument over custody to a judge's restraining order is shorter than people admit, and when that order reached into Alexis Davis's home, cutting Scout off from a grandmother whose house still smelled like the mother she lost, it turned bureaucracy into heartbreak. The same paper wall held back Aunts Christina and Molly and, by extension, the sense of messy, affectionate belonging they bring with them. It is a bitter paradox that the adults said these decisions would stabilize a child, while each one snipped another thread from the safety net she used to trust. Loss makes magpies of children, they collect the bright pieces of any love still within reach. Willow, warm and gentle and steady in a way that made sense to Scout, became one of those bright pieces. Wanting to call her mom wasn't treachery, just a child's improvisation of family after the script had been torn up. When Drew blocked even that harmless word, he didn't simply veto a nickname, he dismissed the coping mechanism of a grieving heart. That alone doesn't create a shooter, of course. But trauma rarely manifests as a grand motive. It accumulates as 100 straw-light humiliations and disappointments that adults fail to notice. Each slammed door echoes a little longer than the last. Each correction, however reasonable on paper, becomes a reminder that the map of Scout's life is being redrawn without her input. The soul searches for agency wherever it can find it, and when it cannot find it, it sometimes manufactures a terrible imitation. If you step away from motive and examine method, one question defines the case: how would a child get a gun? The answer shudders toward Elizabeth Weber's living room, where the weapon ultimately surfaced, a breadcrumb so audacious it first felt like a plant. But Elizabeth's home is also a crossroads, children come and go, families overlap, confidences spill across homework tables and snack bowls. The investigators will likely piece together an ordinary, devastating logistics, an unlocked cabinet during a repair call, a moment of inattention at a family gathering, a whispered dare between classmates who know more about the world than the adults think. If Scout had access to Drew's house, and any determined kid knows the rhythms of a parent's routine, then the logistics stop being unthinkable and start being miserably plausible. A quick visit framed as wanting to see the Quartermaines, a backpack too heavy for library books, a hallway where the hush feels like permission. These are not the moves of a criminal mastermind. They are the desperate choreography of a child choosing the only action that promises to make the noise in her head go quiet. Opportunity, however, is nothing without cover, and this is where the town's oldest reflex, protect the young at all costs, might have kicked in. Michael Corinthos, described by some as a witness who saw a small figure fleeing Drew's property and by others as a man stricken by too much loyalty, becomes the hinge of the theory. The idea that he recognized Scout and closed his mouth is both damning and compassionate. Damning, because a lie of omission can let violence go unaddressed. Compassionate, because he would not be the first Corinthos to fall on the sword of family. The calculus is cruel. If the shooter is a child buried under grief and neglect, the system will offer psychiatric treatment, a sealed record, and a chance at a life not wholly defined by one catastrophic act. Exposing her publicly would fulfill no moral duty that could not be met by quiet intervention. And yet every secret exacts interest. Michael's silence would reshape investigations, reassign blame, and ignite the town's appetite for scapegoats. Blame always seems to land on Elizabeth Weber's porch, and not only because the gun appeared there. Elizabeth is the person Port Charles persistently asks to be both nurse and confessor. She binds wounds, then discovers those wounds are plot devices lodged in her own story. If the weapon migrated through her house, the easy conclusion is complicity. The harder, truer conclusion is proximity. Elizabeth's life is woven into nearly every family in town, including children connected by classroom memories more than bloodlines. In a place where grief circulates like weather, her home is a shelter, and sometimes a lost and found for other people's ghosts. Elizabeth's involvement, then, is less an indictment than a turning point. Her discovery forces the narrative to stop pretending this is the work of a faceless enemy and to confront the unsettling possibility that the shooter is someone everyone has hugged at a birthday party. Dante Falconeri, forever the cop with a father's heart, is positioned perilously between duty and protection. On one side is the oath, the crime, and the chain of custody that stretches tautly from a ballistics lab to a prosecutor's desk. On the other is a child who still looks at him like a lighthouse, and the knowledge that Drew's choices lit most of the fuse. Dante understands better than anyone that law enforcement can repair public order while simultaneously shattering a private life beyond repair. If the evidence begins to whisper the same name the rumor mill already bellows, his next steps will define not only the case but the town's conscience. Does he move quickly, trusting that a swift, sealed court process will minimize harm? Or does he approach like a father approaching a sleeping child after a nightmare, quietly, gently, choosing words that lessen the self-loathing that will surely come with the truth? Psychologically, the profile is not as sensational as people fear. Children do not become shooters in a vacuum. The precipitating event, an explosive fight, a humiliating confrontation, a sudden realization that another tether has been cut, would have landed on a foundation already cracked by mourning and chronic invalidation. The weapon becomes a language when words fail. To adults, the act is unforgivable because it violates the central bargain of caretaking: we protect you, so you must never hurt us. To the child, it can feel like the only way to be heard at a volume the adult world cannot ignore. This does not absolve, it explains. And explanation matters because it points toward a path that is not merely punitive. Therapy, accountability framed in age-appropriate terms, and a community commitment to rebuild the relationships that were severed by paperwork rather than cruelty, those could still knit something livable from this. Then there is Drew, the man at the vortex. If he wakes to the full reality of who may have pulled the trigger, he will face the bleak math of love gone rigid. His instinct will be to forgive, and then to turn forgiveness into an entirely new set of controls that he calls safeguards. The challenge for him will be to learn that control is not protection, that a daughter allowed to speak uncomfortable truths is safer than one strapped into a life within which she cannot breathe. Whether he can learn that while healing from a gunshot is an open question. Trauma shrinks imaginations. If he cannot imagine a different way to love his child than the one that brought them here, the cycle will continue, only now, the silence will be radioactive. What would justice look like in this scenario? The law provides one answer: evaluations, treatment plans, supervised custody arrangements, confidentiality to prevent permanent stigma. But Port Charles has always pursued a parallel justice, the kind measured in kitchen table conversations, in reconciliations brokered by people who despise each other for everything except the child caught between them. Alexis, Christina, and Molly will see this not as a courtroom fight but as the reclamation of their right to love, a right that the restraining order stole under the guise of structure. Carly, who knows better than most the cost of violent secrets and motherly ferocity, will be tempted to shape the narrative to protect both Scout and Michael, even if that means becoming the lightning rod for suspicion. Willow, the woman Scout chose with her heart long before anyone approved the vocabulary, could become the bridge across which genuine repair finally walks. And Elizabeth? If the town were wise, it would realize that the young woman who found the gun is also the one most likely to understand what to do next. She has walked children back from cliffs adults never saw. She has the moral imagination to hold two truths at once, that a shooting is an unforgivable harm and that a child who shoots can still be redeemed. In the days ahead, her home will be scrutinized, her choices parsed, her character put on trial by people who have benefited from her quiet steadiness for years. But it's equally likely that her steadiness becomes the fulcrum for a new kind of justice, one that refuses to trade a little girl's future for a cleaner headline. Which brings us back to the terrible, magnetic question, could Scout have done it? The theory's power lies in how relentlessly it accords with the facts that matter, emotional facts, the kind television rarely names but always trades in. A girl who has been stripped of language will reach for an act that shouts. A father who confuses guardianship with control will not hear the shout until it becomes a sound that breaks glass. A town that prides itself on protecting its own will decide, once again, whether protection means punishing a symptom or treating a cause. The discovery of the gun at Elizabeth's house didn't simply change the direction of the investigation. It forced the investigators, official and otherwise, to look in a mirror that doesn't flatter any of them. Maybe, when the truth comes out, it won't be Scout. Maybe the narrative will pivot towards some overlooked adult with a familiar appetite for power and retribution. But the mere plausibility of this theory has already done its damage, exposing every brittle place where love calcified into rule. And if it is Scout, the story that follows cannot be solved with handcuffs and a press release. It will require something rarer on daytime television than even a shock twist, a stubborn, daily kindness that refuses to abandon a child for the sake of moral tidiness. Port Charles has performed miracles before. It might be asked to try one again, not to erase what happened in a familiar closing montage, but to ensure that the little girl at the center of this isn't remembered only as the moment the town lost its innocence, but as the moment it finally learned how to protect it.